civic education anymore. Now it's just American government or US politics. And we're just teaching you how the system works, like bare minimum, right? What we can do in one semester, which is all that's required in most states in America. And I think that part of that is because there was this effort to sort of distance the government from whitewashing, manipulation, all of the sort of negative epithets that were being thrown at those classes. And so trying to rebrand them as, hey, just the facts, ma'am. We're just going to be teaching people about government and how government works was sort of a way to bring those classes back or to continue them without pissing people off, for lack of a better terminology. But yeah,
Okay, yeah,
I thought that he
I
was great.
yeah, 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 that's something that still sticks with me. I've actually mentioned in like a couple of episodes now, and then what you said kind of fell in line with what Alex was talking about in that episode. So I guess that kind of already, I want to say already answers this question, but it is, I guess, part of the answer to this next question. So why do you think some efforts to fix civics education haven't been as successful as they could have been? And we'll say more specifically for more recent uh, initiatives, since you talked about more historical ones. So more recent initiatives, or put a different way, what do you think some civics initiatives get wrong when trying to improve the civic knowledge of the citizenry? And I'm talking about ones that are legitimately trying to improve civic knowledge. And what do you recommend instead?
So I guess so I have a little bit of an issue with the premise, right? Because I don't think that there's a lot of initiatives that are out there that are trying to improve the civic knowledge of citizens. So it's not that there's all of these initiatives out there and I'm going to
Okay.
tell you what they're doing wrong. So I think that there are a few, and a lot of the ones that are, sort of organized, sustained programs that are attempting to increase civic knowledge are focused on students. They're looking at civic education as something that happens in the classroom, and they're focused on what they can do to get those numbers up from Nate that we talked about. Right, to make sure that students that are in school, elementary school, middle school, high school, are going to come out of there with a better understanding of civic knowledge. And I think that the biggest mistake that those school focused initiatives get is that they're not looking at civic education as something that requires lifelong learning. And I think that's the biggest issue that I try to drive home in this book. The book that I created is not just about teaching people how government works in terms of there's three branches and this is what the legislative branch does and this is what the other branch does. And so that's in there, but that's not the point. Right? The point of the book is to say civic education is a lifelong learning tool, right? I consider it to be a tool. As we talked about before, it's, in my opinion, every citizen's most important tool. It's the most important tool that you have to help you cut through misinformation and disinformation, lies and political spin. It's the most important tool that you have as a citizen to help you to actually hold politicians accountable and play the role that you're meant to play in our society to keep our democracy going. So I think that civic education is a tool, and it's not something that is that should be sort of relegated to the classroom. I think the biggest problem in general, not just with these initiatives, but just in the way that we talk about civic education in America, is that it's all focused on students. It's all focused on K through 12 classroom learning. And that is very important. I mean, we see from NAEP's statistics that that is very important. But that shouldn't be the only place that people are learning about civic education. So I guess this kind of segues for me into what I see as like the call to action in the book. So what I want is I want to create nothing short of a community education movement. My mantra is think outside of the classroom, right? Civic education is not something that is only for K through 12 students or even college students for that matter. Civic education is not just for students. It's something that's important for every American, across the country. Everybody, even if you don't vote, right? Civic education is what's going to be important for you in order to be able to make an informed decision as to whether you want to vote or not. Let alone, who you want to vote for if you decide to participate. Right. So I think that civic education is so important. It's the sort of bedrock of our society, but we treat it in terms of, it's just a class that students need to study for and they need to get better grades. They need to score more higher on these exams. And then we just kind of leave it at that. I use an analogy in the book where I compare it to driving, and I say, around the same time in your life, you're faced with these two different decisions, right? One of them is to start driving a car, and then a couple years later, the other one is graduating from high school, figuring out what you want to do in your life, and deciding whether or not you want to register to vote, right? So, um, as somebody who is 15 or 16, 17, whatever the laws are in your state, you decide to go get your driver's license. Well, you have to take a test, right? You have to take a written test and you have to take a road test. And then once you take that road test, unless you really screw up, unless you do something bad, you don't have to take any more tests. You never have to take that test again. You're just, you can drive for the rest of your life until we say you can no longer
Yeah.
drive, right? And that kind of makes sense, I guess, because the rules of the road aren't going to change that much. The signs on the road aren't going to change. The way that you drive, what lane you're supposed to be in, that's not going to change, right? But when it comes to voting, that should not be treated the same way, right? It shouldn't be just you take a test or you take a class when you're 17 or 18 years old, and then that's it. You never have to learn anything else
Right.
about civics or the way that our government works for the rest of your life. Excuse me. It should never be that way, right? This requires lifelong learning. This is something that we should be constantly visiting, constantly learning about, um, right? Because it is such an important part of the way that our society works, the way that our country works. And so I think that that's really the biggest problem, right? We need to think outside of the classroom. We need to stop thinking about civic education as something that just happens in schools. We need to stop thinking about it in terms of if students don't know something, it's because the schools and the teachers got it wrong and they need to fix it, right? Instead of it being a they problem, we need to think about it in terms of a we problem, an us problem, right? So it is my job to take responsibility for my civic education. If I want to make sure that I am playing my role in society and that I am holding politicians accountable, then it's my job to make sure that I know what I need to know. And so that's what I want to start is this community. I call it a community education movement. And I really compare it to Black History Month. So when I was teaching at the College of Charleston, I didn't just teach political science, I also taught African American studies. And that gave me the opportunity to really learn about one of my heroes, who is Carter G. Woodson, who's the guy that invented or created Black History Month. So most people don't know the story
Oh.
behind it. Quick story because I'm all about the stories. um, quick story is in the 19 teens, Carter G. Woodson, who had been one of the first African Americans to receive a PhD in education in the United States, he was an educator and he had worked at a couple of different schools and realized that there was no information being taught in these schools about Black people's accomplishments or achievements in history or about African civilizations at all. And so he went to a couple of different educators and to administrators, talked to them about it. And basically the response that he got back was, "What are you talking about? There's nothing to see here, right? There are no accomplishments. If there were, we'd be teaching about them. And so because we're not teaching about them, that just means they don't exist, right?" And he knew that that
Yeah.
wasn't the case. And so he decided to, instead of moaning and complaining about it, he decided to take matters into his own hands. He didn't have any way to, affect the curriculum at different schools. And so he decided to do what he could do on his own. So he started an organization. And then out of that organization, he started a journal, right? And this was, I believe it's still being published today. Um, and the journal, the whole point behind it was basically an early version of crowdsourcing. So he would invite different researchers and scholars from all across the country and across the world, really, who were writing about these things, Black people's accomplishments and throughout history and also African civilizations. And he would get all of the research and collect it in these journals. And so he was basically creating this body of knowledge about Black history through these journals. And so, well, the journal doesn't matter if nobody reads it, right? And so he hired an army of graduate students to travel all around the country selling these journals door to door, like door to door salesmen. And they went to people's homes, they went to small schools and community groups and churches and tried to get people to get subscriptions to these journals. And so once he got to a certain level of um, success with this, and he wanted to draw even more attention to it, he created what he called Negro History Week as a celebration to just sort of highlight the efforts, right? And to focus people's attention on this for 1 week out of the year. And that way it would kind of make people want to subscribe to these journals and, let more people know about what was going on. And so, long story short, Negro History Week was the celebration that grew into Black History Month. It started in 1922,
Oh,
and by 1970, it was being celebrated at colleges all across the country. And the students at Kent State University decided that they actually wanted to extend this celebration to be an entire month long instead of just 1 week. And so they renamed it Black History Month, extended it to a whole month, and that's the celebration that we all, kind of follow along with today. Even McDonald's, right, famously has put a lot of investment over the years into celebrating Black History Month. We have the Black History 365 and, different things that come on television. And all of this got started just because this one guy saw where there was this lack of what was being taught in schools, realized that he couldn't do anything about it through the school curriculum itself, but that if he could raise awareness in just the average community among Americans, that he could encourage people to do their own research and sort of learn about this in their own way. And that's really the sort of model, the big picture for me of what I would love to do is I would love to just encourage people across America to stop thinking about civic education in terms of the classroom and teachers and students, right? Start thinking about it in terms of a responsibility as an American citizen. Start thinking about it in terms of a tool that every citizen should have that they can use to sort of help them get through this weird political environment that we find ourselves in. And so that's kind of what I want to do.
that's an interesting parallel that you brought up with the Black History Month. But I agree. Just this, there is a lot of times too much of a short term focus on how do we teach kids now or teach adults now about this, but don't really have that sustainability focus on the how do we make this long lasting where it's actually going to stick with them. I think that's a very good point to bring up. I mean, really, so many things that we teach people, just especially when teach people practice, make them practice for a test or an exam, and then after that, the information's gone, poof, and did they really ultimately learn anything, kind of thing, I think you see that with civics especially. So definitely can appreciate that motive, that
Well,
goal
and
for civics for all.
woe to anyone who has to just depend. I'm sorry. I was just going to say woe to anyone who has to depend on only the knowledge that they learned when they were 17 years old for any particular topic.
Right.
If you had to deal with something every single day in your life for the rest of your life and the only thing that you ever learned about it was when you were 17 years old, good luck, right? It's
Yeah.
not going to go so
Well,
well.